Let's see if the maid's son knows what a pawn is. The millionaire smirked. Seconds before his jaw hit the floor, at a high society garden party. Laughter sparkled like champagne until a bored millionaire pulled a cruel stunt. He invited the black maid's young son to a chess match, expecting a laugh. But as the first move echoed on the marble table, the boy's quiet genius turned a joke into a revelation and a life into a legacy. If this story moved you, made you feel something stir deep in your heart, don't leave just yet. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales that remind us greatness often hides in the most unexpected places. Your like, comment, and share can help voices like his be heard around the world. It was the annual Langston Gala, tradition of wealth and spectacle that rolled out each spring on the vast, manicured lawns of the Langston estate. Golden chandeliers glowed from inside the grand mansion, casting light through towering glass windows like fireflies suspended in motion. Guests with surnames that often preceded their reputations floated through the marble halls and onto the terrace in silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. The scent of white roses and imported caviar mingled in the air. Conversations echoed with the unmistakable cadence of affluence. Deals struck. Vacations bragged about. Children compared like stock portfolios. But just outside the spotlight, in the shadow of all that opulence, Eleanor moved like a whisper unseen, but essential as she wore her crisp maid's uniform with quiet dignity, her hair tied back, her eyes always alert but never invasive. It wasn't her first time at the gala, but this was the first year she'd had no choice but to bring her son Micah along. Childcare had fallen through. Her neighbor had a fever. She'd begged to take the night off, but with guests arriving from New York and Europe, there was no room for absence. So she brought Micah, promising he would stay out of the way. Be silent, invisible, just like her. Micah, barely 9, clung shyly to her skirt as they moved from the kitchen to the ballroom, then to the garden. His other hand held tightly to a worn composition notebook, its corners frayed, its cover bent, filled with pages of puzzles, patterns, and hand-drawn grids. He didn't speak much, never did. He preferred to observe, to listen, to sit in corners and stare at the lines between things like he could see something no one else could. As twilight melted into night, the guests spilled into the garden. White tents fluttered in the breeze. Champagne flowed, and soft jazz drifted from a string quartet hidden near the hedges. Toward the back, beneath a heated canopy, a group of gentlemen were gathered around a chessboard set atop a marble table. Their laughter was occasional but sharp, competitive, performative. Like everything else in their lives, Jonathan Reed, one of the newer elites on the scene, leaned back in his chair with a kind of confidence that only billionaires or children possess. He was younger than most of the guests, mid-30s maybe, but already wielded power like a man twice his age. Jonathan was the founder of a tech empire that had revolutionized online security and monetized privacy itself. Sharp jaw, icy blue eyes, and a voice that carried even when he whispered. People respected him. People also avoided disagreeing with him. He noticed Micah standing just beyond the cordoned hedge, watching the board with stillness that didn't quite match his age. "The boy?" someone asked, chuckling. "The maid's kid." "I think," someone replied. Jonathan tilted his head, amused. "Maid's kid, huh? Bet he thinks the rook is a horse." Eleanor had just stepped into view, refilling glasses near the back of the tent when she heard him. She stopped mid-step. Her eyes flicked to Micah, who looked up at her with the same calm expression he always wore. She moved toward them, alarmed but composed. "He's just waiting for me to finish. I'll take him inside," she said quickly, her hand already reaching for Micah's shoulder. But Jonathan was already waving him over with that Richmond grin that suggested amusement and cruelty were first cousins. No, let him play. I want to see what he's got." Micah looked up at his mother. She hesitated. Her eyes asked him a question only he could answer. Micah nodded, not defiantly, but like he understood something she didn't. Jonathan cleared the board. "White or black, little man?" Micah sat down slowly. He placed his notebook on the ground beside him, then touched a pawn like it was something sacred. "You go first," he said softly. Jonathan chuckled, amused. How polite he made his move, quickly, casually, for an aggressive opener. "Standard," Micah responded. Instantly C5, the Sicilian defense. Jonathan blinked. Another move. Then another. Jonathan's posture straightened. Wine forgotten. Micah wasn't just playing. He was constructing, calculating. His moves weren't random or borrowed, they were predictive. Responding not to what had happened but to what would happen next. The group of guests slowly quieted. One by one they began to watch. The laughter faded. Even the jazz seemed to soften, like the world was making space for something extraordinary. Micah's face was unreadable, his hands steady. Each move came with rhythm but no rush. His eyes rarely left the board. Jonathan, meanwhile, began to falter. He leaned forward, tapped his fingers, recalculated. Micah forked a bishop and a knight. Jonathan stared. 5 moves later he'd castled 2 moves. After that, he'd sacrificed his queen. The spectators now stood in stunned silence, their wine glasses suspended mid-air. Elena didn't move. She stood behind the tent flap, frozen in a kind of terrified pride. What if this angered Jonathan? What if they called it arrogance? What if They thought her son was mocking a man worth billions. Then came the final blow. Micah's rook slid across the board with gentle finality. Checkmate. 14 minutes. Jonathan stared at the board like it had insulted him. Micah sat back, not smug, not grinning, just quiet. Jonathan finally looked up. What's your name? Micah. Who taught you? No one, Micah replied. I just see things. What kind of things? Micah thought, then answered. What people don't. Silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense with realization, and somewhere behind the crowd, a retired grandmaster named Luis Aragon stepped forward. Play me, he said simply. Jonathan laughed, shaking his head as if waking from a dream. You're not serious? But Luis already had it set out. Micah turned to his mother. She looked back, stunned but nodding through her tears this time. The game lasted 22 minutes. Micah won again. Didn't speak for a while afterward. Then he approached Eleanor with trembling hands. Your son is the most naturally gifted mind I've seen since Magnus Carlsen. Maybe even more. She whispered a thank you that barely left her lips. Louise touched Micah's shoulder gently. Would you let me teach you? Micah looked to his mother. She nodded, and that was the moment everything changed. The next morning, Eleanor woke up to 3 phone calls and a news van outside her building. Footage of Micah's match had made its way onto social media, millions of views. Headlines read, Maid's son humiliates millionaire in chess match. Child prodigy discovered at gala. From broom to brilliance, the boy who outsmarted the elite. She panicked. Was this too much attention? Was it safe? Then came the knock at the door. Jonathan. It stood there, not with ego, not with a smirk, but with sincerity. Beside him stood Luis Aragon again, and a woman from the National Chess Federation. We want to sponsor him, Jonathan said. School, coaching, international tournaments. Not as a handout, as an investment in someone who already surpasses us. Eleanor stood motionless, trying to breathe. Micah stepped forward. Only if I can still go to school. I don't want to just win. I want to understand everything. We smiled wide. That's the best answer I've ever heard. Jonathan crouched down to Micah's level. You'll get both. And just like that, the boy who was once invisible, standing behind his mother's apron strings, became the youngest player ever accepted into the national training program. By 12 he was competing internationally. By 14 he was writing algorithms that modeled infinite move trees. By 16 he wasn't just winning, he was rewriting the way the game was studied. But what mattered more than trophies or titles was what Micah did with Ethiop and a community center called the 64 Squares, a place where kids from forgotten neighborhoods could learn chess, math, coding, and confidence. He filled its walls with color, its rooms with music, and its halls with laughter. And at the front door, a plaque read, Greatness is not who you are born to, it's what you choose to see when others don't. And beneath it, the name of the boy who once sat at a marble table in silence, while the world finally listened. Micah, Emmanuel, child of vision, son of grace, master of the game. The garden was no longer filled with laughter. The wind carried no music. The champagne flutes were still full in the hands of stunned guests, held mid-air like the night itself had been paused. Time didn't slow, it stopped. A stillness swept over the crowd like a sudden winter, all eyes fixed on a boy no one had noticed when he first stepped foot on the estate. Micah's fingers floated over the pieces, light as feathers, precise as blades. Every move was quiet, calculated. He didn't fidget, didn't look up, didn't shift in his seat. There was a rhythm to his thinking, a silent drum the rest of the world could not hear. It wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. He saw the board not as it was, but as it could become, like a painter staring at a blank canvas but already knowing the final stroke. Jonathan moved quickly at first, out of ease, but then his hand started hesitating. He adjusted his sleeve, reached for his drink but didn't sip. He leaned forward, as if by narrowing his eyes he could shrink the gap in their minds. Micah didn't blink. The knight slid across the board again, leaping from square to square like a spirit with purpose. A trap was sprung, bishop cornered, a pawn sacrificed, not in loss, but in strategy. Micah's pieces didn't just move, they danced, and in doing so, they whispered. They whispered of a boy who had sat at kitchen tables with torn paper and a second-hand board, playing imaginary games against champions he had only read about in books no one bought for him. They whispered of night shifts where his mother scrubbed hotel bathrooms while he waited alone, solving problems scribbled on napkins. They whispered of a genius born in silence, growing in the dark, waiting to be seen. Across from him, Jonathan's breathing changed. His smirk, once carved into his face like armor, began to falter. He pulled at his tie as if it had suddenly become a noose. His fingers tapped the table. He made another move, then looked again and realized it had been a mistake. Micah was already moving his rook. He wasn't playing to win. He was playing like he knew he had already won. The crowd stood still. Even the servers had stopped. Trays hovered in the air. A champagne glass trembled in a woman's hand. Her eyes locked on the board as if her heartbeat now depended on it. The men who once laughed now stood with furrowed brows, one even checking his phone for the boy's name, assuming he had to be someone. But there was nothing. No record. No Prodigy biography. just the son of a maid. Micah. Eleanor stood near the edge of the tent, her eyes wide and wet, a napkin still crumpled in her hand from when she had wiped the condensation off a wine bottle. She had promised to blend into the background, had promised that they wouldn't cause trouble, that they'd be invisible. But how could she ask her son to shrink when brilliance made him burn so bright? She was scared of how Jonathan would react, of what it would mean if her son embarrassed. A man like him, a man with money, with reach, with power. She clutched the napkin tighter. Micah made his final move. It was quiet, so quiet it almost felt like the garden itself had been emptied. The rook slid into place. The king had nowhere to run. Checkmate. Jonathan stared. He didn't speak. His hand hovered over his own piece for a second, as if hoping he could still change something, as if hoping it wasn't real. Then, in a quick, almost violent motion, he picked up the black king and slammed it down on its side. The noise cracked, silence like thunder. Then came the sound no one expected, a slow, deliberate clap. One pair of hands, then another, and another, until the garden was filled with applause, not loud, not explosive, but reverent. Jonathan stood from his chair, his face unreadable, then stepped back as if trying to create distance between himself and the humiliation. He felt, but no one was laughing, because this wasn't funny anymore. It wasn't mockery. A man stepped forward, older, balding at the crown, wearing a charcoal suit with a silver pin shaped like a knight. His eyes were small but sharp, and his steps were confident, measured. This was not a man who approached anything without reason. He came to the table, looked at Micah, then at the board. He studied it for a moment, his brow furrowing. He traced the sequence of moves in his mind, then he looked up. "Who taught you to play?" Micah finally raised his head. His voice was soft but steady. "No one. I just see patterns." The man stared at him as if trying to understand what he meant, not just with the words, but with the way he said them, as if Micah hadn't learned the game, but been born knowing it. "What kind of patterns?" he asked again. Micah tilted his head, glancing at the board. "I see the way they move, what they want, where they're afraid to go. I just see it." Eleanor felt her knees weaken. She had heard him speak like this before, about numbers, codes, shapes and clouds, but never in front of anyone else. Never like this. Her eyes welled with tears, not just from pride, but from the ache of having known something about your child for so long, and finally someone else saw it too. She had always known, from the moment Micah solved a Rubik's cube without being taught, from the moment he counted backwards in prime numbers before kindergarten, from the moment he beat a chess computer on a borrowed tablet in the back room of a diner while she cleaned the floors. She had known, but who would have listened? Who would have believed the word of a hotel maid? The man in the suit turned to the crowd. "This boy is a savant. That sequence, no one under 15 has pulled that variation in a real game." A buzz rippled through the crowd. Guests exchanged whispers. Some looked at Micah with awe, some with confusion, some with a jealousy so subtle it tasted like shame. They were watching the rewriting of their assumptions in real time. The story they'd told themselves, that genius only wore suits, or walked red carpets, or came from private academies, cracking. The man stepped forward again. "I'm Luis Aragon. I played for the national team. I've trained grandmasters, and I've never seen anything like this." Micah blinked. "Would you play me?" Luis asked. Jonathan scoffed in the background. "You're not serious." Luis smiled, still watching Micah. "I've never been more serious." A new board was fetched. The pieces reset. The crowd grew larger. Someone had begun recording. The air buzzed with a kind of electricity that couldn't be bottled. Eleanor took a step closer but stayed behind the line. She didn't want to interfere, didn't want to shatter whatever it was that had finally begun unfolding. Micah sat again. Luis made the first move. Micah responded. It was no longer a spectacle. It was a revelation. Each piece moved with intention. Luis wasn't playing gently. He tested him, pushed him, probed for weakness. There was none. Micah read the board like a story. Every move a sentence, every sacrifice a plot twist. Luis wiped his brow halfway through. The game stretched beyond 20 minutes, but the ending was never in doubt. Not to Micah, not to Eleanor, not anymore. Micah won. Luis didn't speak at first. He leaned back in his chair, then stood, slowly. He reached out his hand, not to shake, but to honor. "You're not a student," he said quietly. "You're a mirror. You reflect brilliance back at the world. I would be honored to teach you, but the truth is, there's not much I can teach." Micah glanced at his mother. She nodded through her tears, her hand pressed over her mouth. The crowd erupted again, but this time with something deeper than applause. It was respect. Jonathan lingered by the tent's edge, his glass now empty, his eyes full of something he didn't understand. Defeat, envy, maybe admiration, maybe regret. He approached Eleanor later that evening, his hands opened, voice softer. "I underestimated him. I underestimated you. I was wrong." Eleanor didn't reply. She didn't need to. The next morning, everything changed. 3 calls, 2 emails, a knock on the door. The National Chess Federation, a private scholarship board. a tech startup offering to sponsor tutoring equipment, entry fees. And behind all of it, Luis Aragon, with a handwritten letter of recommendation and a promise. Your son deserves the world. We're ready to help him reach it. Micah stood by the window, looking out at the city. The sky was gray, but his eyes were bright. Can I still go to school? He asked. I don't want to just play. I want to understand everything. Yes, Luis said. You can have it all. Micah smiled. For the first time, and somewhere, in a grand estate, where silence once held power, the sound of a checkmate still echoed, changing not just the game, but the story. Because the boy no one saw didn't just play chess, he rewrote the rules. The next morning, the sky over their small apartment was the color of steel. Clouds sagged low as if they bore the weight of a secret about to be told. Inside, the apartment was still a quiet kind of still, like a breath held before a decision. The carpet was worn in all the places it had been walked most, and the curtains let in a soft, sleepy light. Eleanor was standing at the sink, hands submerged in warm dishwater, though the breakfast dishes had already been cleaned. She wasn't washing plates anymore. She was waiting for what, she didn't know. Maybe for the sound of the world changing. Maybe just the next quiet hour. Micah sat at the table with his notebook open. Not writing, just drawing loops in the margins like a heartbeat stalling. He hadn't said much since the gala. Not out of fear, not even surprise. It was something else. As if the night before had confirmed something he'd always believed but never dared to name. That his thoughts weren't too strange. That his patterns meant something. That maybe, even just maybe, he belonged somewhere grander than the silence he'd grown up in. Then came the knock. Not a hard bang. Not the impatient rap of a landlord or the dull thud of mail delivery. It was intentional, measured. 2 knocks, then 3. Then silence. Eleanor dried her hands on a dish towel, her heart already ahead of her as she moved to the door. Her fingers hovered over the knob before she pulled it open, and there he stood, Jonathan Reed, no longer the smirking billionaire with wine in his hand, no longer the man who invited her son to the table as a joke. He stood there in a dark coat, collar turned up, eyes solemn, no entourage, no photographers, just him. Beside him stood Grandmaster Luis Aragon, the man who had seen Micah not as a servant son but as a mind the world wasn't ready for. Luis held a large flat box wrapped in deep burgundy paper, and in his other hand, an envelope thick and cream-colored, the kind that made your hands shake even before you opened it. Jonathan cleared his throat. There was no trace of ego, only effort, as if every word was being pulled from a part of him that had only recently learned humility. We'd like to sponsor Micah, not as charity, not to make headlines, but because he's already better than most of us will ever be. Eleanor didn't speak, couldn't. Her fingers gripped the doorknob as her other hand reached, slowly, toward the envelope Luis extended. Her hands trembled as she took it. Inside were pages, official letterhead, ink signatures, institutional seals, a full scholarship to the most prestigious chess institute in the country, travel stipends, living accommodations, tutors, equipment, a seat at the national juniors, everything laid out like a future that had just been waiting for someone to believe in him. Micah stepped into the doorway beside her. His eyes scanned the envelope, then met Jonathan's. Only if I can still go to school, he said. His voice was steady, but his hands were clenched at his sides. I want to learn more than just chess. Jonathan looked at him, really looked, like seeing him as more than just a prodigy, more than a player, a boy, a human, a mind with hunger. You'll get both. That was the moment it all changed, not with a flash, but with a quiet agreement between a boy who dreamed in silence and a man learning to listen. From that day forward, their lives unraveled in the most unexpected ways. Micah moved into a new world, not a palace, not a mansion, but a modest academy campus where he was surrounded by minds that spoke his language, not always in words, but in ideas. He had a dorm room with a desk he could fill with books, not second-hand, but new, a laptop that didn't glitch, notebooks that weren't scavenged from school dumpsters. He had coaches who didn't see his skin or his mother's job. They saw moves, precision, brilliance. Luis became more than a mentor. He became a compass. He never told Micah what to think, only showed him how to sharpen what he already saw. Sometimes their lessons weren't even at the board. They sat in parks, on rooftops, in coffee shops. They talked about history, math, art, music, because Luis believed chess was never just about the game. It was about how you moved in the world. Eleanor visited every weekend. She never asked for much, just a chair in the corner while he studied, a cup of tea with the staff, a hand on his shoulder before a tournament. She still cleaned rooms for a while, still folded towels into perfect thirds, but she walked with her head higher, not because her son was famous now, but because the world had finally seen what she always had, and the wins began to stack. Regional, national, international. Micah became the youngest American to win a major fight tournament, then the youngest to beat a reigning champion in a blitz. Match commentators didn't know what to call his style. Some said intuitive, others said reckless brilliance. Luis called it invisible elegance. What they meant was he played from somewhere deeper than memory or theory. He played like he was telling a story no one else could write. By 15, Micah had a name that carried weight. He was featured in magazines, on news segments, invited to speak at schools, to appear on stages with billionaires and tech giants. But he never spoke for long. He kept his answers short. And always, when asked how he learned, he said the same thing. I just watched. He watched his mother fold linens and build symmetry from scraps. Watched people's eyes when they lied. Watched buses arrive late and teachers dismiss the quiet ones. That's watched how the world moved pieces around without asking them why. That's where he learned. That's where he grew. Then came the World Championship qualifier in Prague. Micah was 16. The world watched. He sat across from the Russian prodigy Sergei Markov, known for his brutal efficiency and mechanical openings. The match was streamed live, watched by millions. Commentators debated Micah's odds, called him the underdog, but Eleanor just sat in the front row, hands folded, eyes shining. Micah won in 27 moves, not with aggression but with grace. After the match, Sergei shook his hand and whispered something in Russian. Micah nodded. Later he told a journalist what Sergei had said. He said he'd never felt outplayed before, but that it had been an honor. Micah didn't celebrate with fireworks or parties. He went back to his room, opened his notebook, and wrote one sentence. If I can see the game, maybe I can help others see themselves at night. He made a decision. He didn't want to build a trophy case. He wanted to build a place where kids like him, quiet, unseen, overlooked, could come and be seen. Not just for how fast they moved or how smart they spoke, but for how they saw the world. He called it the 64 Squares, that started with one room in the neighborhood where he grew up. He used his tournament winnings to rent a small storefront, painted it himself, brought in old boards and new ones, asked for second-hand books from players around the world. The first month, only 7 kids came. By month 3 it was 30, then 50, then a waitlist. He didn't just teach chess. He taught pattern recognition, coding, probability, poetry. He brought in guests, teachers, mentors, scientists, mathematicians. Every kid who walked through the door got a notebook, just like his. And on the inside cover, a sentence: "You are not invisible. The world just hasn't seen your board yet." Eleanor ran the office. She brought snacks, sat with the parents, told her story not with pride, but with hope. She had once worried her son's silence meant he would never be heard. Now his silence made others listen. Micah kept competing, but his heart lived in the center. The way his eyes lit up when a 10-year-old girl beat her coach, when a shy boy stood in front of the whiteboard and explained a puzzle to the others. That's when he felt victorious. He turned down sponsorships, declined celebrity deals. People didn't understand why, but he did, because he knew what mattered. He had once sat on a marble patio while the world laughed. Now he gave other children a chair, a board, a reason to move. At 21, Micah gave a TED Talk, not about chess, about choice, about how every person is a piece waiting to find their place. How his mother had taught him that kings are not born in castles. Sometimes they're born in borrowed apartments, holding notebooks full of dreams. He ended the talk with one line: "Every child is a king if someone just shows them the board." The crowd rose in standing ovation. And Eleanor, sitting in the wings, wiped a tear from her cheek, remembering the first time he moved a pawn across a cardboard square at their kitchen table. He had been 6. Now he was changing the world. ***. Subscribe now for more cinematic emotional stories that uncover the beauty hiding in everyday moments, quietly, brilliantly, one move at a time.